Imagine a battlefield where there is no sky, no sun, no sound except your own breathing, and the scraping of enemy picks somewhere in the darkness digging toward you. This was the war beneath the war, a hidden conflict fought in tunnels so narrow that men crawled on their stomachs through the earth. Australian and New Zealand miners, men who had spent their lives underground, now fighting a different kind of enemy, one they could hear but never see. And they were building something, a weapon so massive, so devastating, that when it finally detonated, the blast was heard in London, 140 miles away. But here's what history forgot to tell you. Some of these men never came back up. Their bodies are still down there, entombed in collapsed tunnels beneath Belgian farmland, and one of the bombs they planted never exploded. It's still there, right now, buried under a quiet field. This is the story of the deadliest mission of the First World War, a mission that most people have never heard of. By the winter of 1915, the Western Front had become a graveyard of failed strategies. The great armies of Europe, millions of men armed with the most advanced weapons ever created, had fought themselves to a standstill. From the English Channel to the Swiss border, a line of trenches stretched for over 400 miles, and neither side could break through. The generals had tried everything: infantry charges, artillery bombardments that lasted for days, poison gas that drifted across no man's land and killed without discrimination. And still, the lines barely moved. Every attempt to advance was met with machine guns and barbed wire. Every offensive produced casualties in the tens of thousands, for gains measured in yards. Something had to change, and so the armies turned to an ancient solution. If they could not go over the enemy, they would go under him. The idea was not new. Military mining, digging tunnels beneath enemy fortifications and blowing them up from below, had been practiced since ancient times. The Romans did it, medieval armies did it, but no one had ever attempted it on this scale, with these weapons, against an enemy who was doing exactly the same thing. What emerged was a war within the war, a hidden conflict fought in absolute darkness, where men listened for the sound of enemy picks through the earth, where victory meant burying your opponent alive, and where the battlefield was measured not in miles, but in feet. And for this war, the British Army needed a very specific kind of soldier. They needed men who understood the earth, men who had spent their lives underground, men who knew how to dig and how to shore up tunnels, how to work in spaces so tight that panic was a constant companion. They needed miners. When the call went out to the Dominions, Australia and New Zealand answered with men forged in some of the harshest mining conditions on Earth. Consider for a moment what it meant to be a miner in early 20th century Australia. The goldfields of Kalgoorlie, the copper mines of Mount Isa, the coal seams of the Hunter Valley. These were places where men descended hundreds of feet into the earth, where temperatures could reach over 40 degrees Celsius, where cave-ins and gas explosions were not possibilities, but certainties. Men died in these mines every year. Those who survived developed a particular set of skills and a particular kind of courage. They understood rock. They understood how the earth moved, how it groaned under pressure, how it warned you before it killed you. They knew how to timber a tunnel so it would hold. They knew how to work in darkness so complete that your hand disappeared inches from your face. And perhaps most importantly, they knew how to stay calm when the walls began to close in. These were the men who would form the Australian tunnelling companies, volunteers most of them, who had already proven themselves in the mines of Queensland, New South Wales and Westerns. Australia. Hard men, quiet men, men who understood that the earth could be both friend and enemy. Among them was a 30-year-old mining engineer from Queensland named Oliver Holmes Woodward. Woodward had spent years in the copper and gold mines of Cloncurry and Mount Morgan before the war. He knew underground work the way a sailor knows the sea, intimately, respectfully, with full awareness of its dangers. When he enlisted in 1915, he could have served in any number of capacities. His education and experience marked him as officer material. But Woodward chose the tunnelling companies. He wanted to use what he knew. He arrived on the Western Front in early 1916, assigned to the 1st Australian Tunnelling Company. Nothing in his mining experience had prepared him for what he found. The tunnels of the Western Front were not like the mines he knew. There were no elevators, no ventilation systems, no safety protocols developed over decades. Instead, there were narrow shafts dug by hand, reinforced with whatever timber could be scrounged, extending into soil that ranged from chalky clay to waterlogged sand. The conditions were medieval, the weapons were modern, and the enemy was everywhere. Woodward quickly learned the first rule of tunnel warfare: the Germans were digging too. Beneath the trenches of Flanders and Picardy, a vast network of tunnels was spreading like roots beneath the battlefield. British tunnels, German tunnels, sometimes running parallel, sometimes intersecting, sometimes close enough that men could hear their enemies breathing through the earth. In his diary, Woodward wrote of those early days with a mixture of professional fascination and growing horror. The work itself was familiar, the digging, the timbering, the constant battle against water and collapse. But there was something else now, something that transformed every shift underground into an exercise in controlled terror: listening. The war beneath the Western Front was, above all, a war of sound. In the darkness of the tunnels, sight was useless. You could not see the enemy. You could not see their tunnels. You could not see the explosives they were planting to kill you, but you could hear them. Both sides developed teams of listeners, men who sat in absolute silence in forward tunnels, pressing sensitive equipment against the earth, straining to detect the distant sound of enemy activity. The equipment evolved rapidly: geophones, seismographs, even modified stethoscopes, anything that could amplify the faint vibrations traveling through soil and rock. The sounds they listened for were specific: the rhythmic scrape of a pick, the dull thud of a shovel, the muffled voices of men working. Every sound was analyzed, triangulated, used to estimate direction and distance. If enemy activity was detected close enough, the alarm would go up, countermeasures would begin. But the listening itself, the hours spent in darkness, in silence, waiting to hear the approach of death, this was what broke men. Imagine sitting in a tunnel barely wide enough to turn around in. The air is stale and hot. Your candle has been extinguished to prevent detection. You are alone, or nearly alone, in darkness so complete that it has physical weight, and you are listening. Listening for the faint scratch of a German pick that might be 50 feet away, or might be 5. If you hear nothing, you wait. If you hear something, you report it. And then you wait for orders. Attack. Retreat. Or the worst order of all, stay in position and continue listening while your comrades prepare a countermine. Men cracked under this pressure. The medical records of the tunneling companies show a pattern of psychological casualties that the army had no name for. Soldiers who had worked in mines their entire lives, men who had faced cave-ins and gas explosions without flinching, emerged from the tunnels of the Western Front, unable to tolerate enclosed spaces. Some could not sleep. Some could not stop shaking. Some simply sat in corners and stared at nothing, their minds retreating from memories too terrible to process. This was the war that Oliver Woodward had entered, a war fought in silence, a war where courage meant controlling fear in absolute darkness, a war where the enemy was invisible, but his presence was constant, a scraping in the earth, growing closer, always closer. And this was only the beginning. The most feared word in the tunneling companies was not attack, or gas, or even collapse. It was camouflage. A camouflage was a small explosive charge, carefully calculated to do something very specific. Unlike the massive mines designed to destroy enemy trenches above ground, a camouflage was meant to stay underground. Its purpose was not to break the surface, but to collapse enemy tunnels and bury the men inside them alive. The mathematics of a camouflage were precise. Too much explosive and the blast would crater upward, revealing your position and wasting the charge. Too little and the enemy tunnel might survive, its occupants shaken but alive. The ideal camouflage produced just enough force to crush the surrounding galleries, entombing anyone inside without leaving a trace on the surface. It was, in essence, a weapon designed to create underground tombs. Both sides used camouflage with terrible frequency. When listeners detected enemy activity nearby, the scrape of picks growing louder, the vibrations growing stronger, the decision had to be made quickly. Blow the camouflage now, while you still had the advantage, or continue digging and risk being blown up yourself. There was rarely time for hesitation. In tunnel warfare, the side that acted first usually survived, the side that waited usually died. The summer of 1916 brought the Australian tunnellers to Hill 60, a small rise in the Flanders landscape that had become one of the most contested pieces of ground on the entire Western Front. The hill itself was unremarkable, barely 60 metres above sea level, but its elevation gave commanding views of the surrounding terrain. Both sides wanted it desperately. Above ground, Hill 60 had changed hands multiple times in bloody infantry assaults. Below ground, a different battle was being fought. British and German tunnels honeycombed the earth beneath the hill, sometimes running within feet of each other. The listeners reported constant activity. The Germans were close, getting closer. On the night of August 21st, 1916, men from the 1st Australian Tunnelling Company were working in a forward gallery when the listeners sent an urgent report. German digging had been detected less than 20 feet away. The sound was unmistakable. Picks striking clay in a steady rhythm. The enemy was coming. Lieutenant Thomas Wilson, the officer in command of the section, faced the decision that every tunnelling officer dreaded. The gallery his men were digging was not yet complete. The explosives for their own mine were not yet in place. But if he waited, the Germans might blow their charge first. Wilson ordered a camouflage prepared. The work was done quickly, quietly. A small charge was placed at the end of the gallery, tamped with sandbags to direct the blast forward. The fuse was cut. The men retreated down the tunnel to a safe distance. At 3:40 in the morning, Wilson gave the order. The explosion was muffled, a deep thump that travelled through the earth rather than the air. The walls of the Australian tunnel shuddered but held. Then silence. The company's war diary recorded the event in 12 words. Camouflage fired at 0340 hours, sounds of enemy activity ceased. 12 words. No mention of casualties. No acknowledgement of what had just happened. Somewhere in the darkness, an unknown number of German soldiers had just been buried alive. But the war diary did not tell the whole story. What the official record omitted, private letters and personal journals preserved. In the hours after the camouflage, the Australian tunnellers remained at their posts, listening. Standard procedure required confirmation that the enemy threat had been neutralised. And so they listened, and heard something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Scratching. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, then stronger. The unmistakable sound of men trying to dig themselves out of a collapsed tunnel. The Germans had not all died in the blast. Some had survived, trapped in whatever pocket of air remained, clawing at the earth with their hands. The scratching continued for hours. Corporal James MacDonald, one of the listeners on duty that night, wrote to his wife a week later. His letter, preserved in the collection of the Australian War Memorial, contains a passage that captures the psychological horror of camouflage warfare better than any official report. "We sat there listening to them dying," MacDonald wrote. "There was nothing we could do. Even if we had wanted to dig them out, the tunnel was too unstable, and they were the enemy. We were supposed to kill them. But this is not war as I understood it. This is something older, something darker. I keep hearing that scratching when I close my eyes. I wonder if I will ever stop hearing it." MacDonald survived the war. He returned to Australia, married, had children. According to family accounts, he never spoke of his time in the tunnels. He never worked underground again. The camouflage war continued throughout 1916 and into 1917. Both sides grew more sophisticated, more ruthless. Listening equipment improved, charges grew larger. The underground battlefield became a maze of tunnels, counter-tunnels, and the collapsed galleries of previous engagements. Men lived with the constant knowledge that death could come at any moment. Not from above, but from below. A charge detonated by an enemy you never saw, bringing down the roof of your tunnel, leaving you to suffocate in the darkness. The psychological toll mounted. Medical officers attached to the tunnelling companies began reporting a pattern of symptoms they had rarely seen before. Men who had worked in mines for decades, veterans of cave-ins, explosions, and every hazard the underground could offer, were breaking down. They could not sleep. They could not tolerate enclosed spaces. They jumped at sudden sounds. Some developed tremors that would not stop. Some simply went silent, retreating into themselves, unable to process what they had experienced. The army called it neurasthenia or shell shock, but the tunnelers knew it was something different. Above ground, soldiers faced death in moments of chaos and violence. Below ground, the tunnelers faced death in silence, in darkness, in the slow torture of listening and waiting. It was not the same. The fear was different, deeper, more intimate. Oliver Woodward, now promoted to captain, watched his men struggle with this invisible enemy. He wrote in his diary of the challenge of maintaining morale in conditions that seemed designed to destroy the human spirit. "The bravest man I know," Woodward wrote, "is not the one who charges a machine gun. It is the man who descends into the darkness, knowing what waits for him, and does his duty anyway. These men are heroes, though no one will ever know their names." And yet, in the midst of this horror, something unexpected occasionally emerged. Moments of mercy, gestures of humanity, proof that even in the darkest conditions imaginable, men sometimes remembered that their enemies were men too. The incident at La Boisselle in the summer of 1916 became one of the most remarkable stories of the Underground War, though it never appeared in any official report. In early July, a section of Australian tunnel collapsed near the village of La Boisselle in the Somme region. 3 men from the 2nd Australian Tunnelling Company were trapped in a forward gallery. Rescue efforts began immediately, but the soil was unstable, saturated with groundwater. Every attempt to dig towards the trapped men risked bringing down more of the tunnel. And there was another problem. German tunnels ran parallel to the Australian galleries, sometimes within a few feet. The rescuers knew that German listeners would hear their digging. At any moment, a camouflage could turn the rescue attempt into a mass grave. Then something extraordinary happened. The Germans stopped digging. For several hours, no sound came from the German tunnels. The Australian listeners reported complete silence, unprecedented during active operations. Then, faintly, a new sound emerged: tapping. A rhythmic pattern that miners recognized instantly as a warning signal. The Germans were communicating. The tapping indicated the location of a gas pocket, a concentration of carbon dioxide that had accumulated in the soil. If the Australian rescuers broke through in that direction, they would be killed instantly. The Germans were warning them away. Private Harold Davies, one of the rescuers, later gave testimony about the incident. "We never knew why they did it," he said. "Perhaps they were miners first and soldiers second. Perhaps they simply could not bear to see men die the way miners die. We were enemies. We had been trying to kill each other for months, but in that moment, they saved our lives." The 3 trapped Australians were eventually rescued through a different route. The German tunnelers resumed their work the next day. The war continued, but the moment stayed with those who witnessed it. A small act of mercy in a war that offered precious few. A reminder that beneath the uniforms, beneath the national flags, beneath the hatred that governments had worked so hard to cultivate, there were still men who recognized their common humanity. These were the conditions under which the Anzac tunnelers fought, and under which they prepared for something far larger, something that would require not weeks of digging, but years, something that would create not a single burial, but thousands of deaths in a single instant. The planning for Operation Messines had already begun, and the men who had learned to kill in darkness would now be asked to build the largest weapon the world had ever seen. In the early months of 1916, while the Camouflage War raged beneath Hill 60 and La Boisselle, a different kind of planning was taking place in the headquarters of the British Second Army. General Herbert Plumer was not a man given to dramatic gestures. Cautious, methodical, and deeply concerned with minimizing casualties, he had earned a reputation as one of the few senior commanders who genuinely cared about the lives of his soldiers. While other generals threw men against fortified positions in the hope that sheer numbers would overcome machine guns, Plumer preferred to wait, to prepare, to strike only when success was certain. And now, Plumer had conceived a plan that would require more patience than any operation in the history of warfare. Messines Ridge dominated the southern portion of the Ypres salient, a bulge in the British lines that exposed troops to German fire from 3 sides. The ridge itself was not high, barely 50 meters above the surrounding plain, But in the flat landscape of Flanders, even modest elevation conferred enormous advantage. German artillery observers on the ridge could see every movement in the British lines. German machine gunners could sweep the approaches with devastating effect. Every attempt to take the ridge by conventional assault had failed, leaving thousands of bodies in the mud below. Plumer proposed something different. If the ridge could not be taken from above, it would be destroyed from below. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition. 21 mines would be planted beneath the German positions along the entire length of the ridge, not the small charges used in camouflage warfare, but massive explosive chambers, some containing nearly 100,000 pounds of ammunition. When detonated simultaneously, these mines would obliterate the German defences, killing or stunning the garrison and allowing British and Anzac troops to advance across objectives that had seemed impregnable. But the plan required something that the Western Front had not yet seen. Patience measured not in days or weeks, but in years. The engineering challenges were immense. The tunnels would need to extend thousands of feet, far longer than anything attempted in the camouflage war. Some would burrow through waterlogged clay that threatened to flood at every advance. Others would pass through layers of sand so unstable that the slightest vibration could trigger a collapse. All would need to remain undetected by German listeners, who were constantly probing for signs of British mining activity. The Anzac tunnelling companies were assigned critical sectors of the operation. The Australians would be responsible for some of the deepest, most technically demanding tunnels, galleries that would descend over 100 feet before levelling off toward the German lines. The work began in the summer of 1916 and would continue for nearly 2 years. Captain Oliver Woodward, now one of the most experienced tunnelling officers on the Western Front, was assigned to the Hill 60 sector. His objective was to plant 2 massive mines beneath the German positions. Charges so large that they would create craters visible from miles away. The challenges he faced were formidable. The soil beneath Hill 60 was a nightmare of waterlogged clay and running sand. Previous tunnelling efforts had been plagued by flooding, collapses, and German countermining. Woodward would need to dig deeper than anyone had gone before, through ground that seemed determined to kill anyone who entered it. He began by studying the geology. Core samples were taken, water tables were mapped. Slowly, a picture emerged of what lay beneath the surface, and of the route that might, just might, allow a tunnel to pass through without detection. The digging began in late 1916. Progress was measured in feet per day, sometimes inches. The men worked in shifts around the clock, crawling through tunnels so narrow that they could barely turn around. The air was foul, thick with the smell of clay and sweat and the ever-present fear of what might be waiting in the darkness ahead. And always, there was the threat of discovery. German tunnelling operations had intensified throughout 1916. The enemy knew that the British were planning something large. Their listeners reported increased activity along the entire front. Countermining teams were dispatched to probe the British lines, searching for the deep galleries that they suspected were being dug. Several times, German tunnels came dangerously close to the Messines workings. Camouflages were exchanged. Men died on both sides, buried in collapsed galleries, or suffocated by the carbon monoxide that lingered after underground explosions. Each encounter brought the risk that the entire operation might be compromised, that the Germans would discover the massive charges being prepared beneath their feet. The tunnellers developed elaborate countermeasures. Listening posts were established at regular intervals, manned around the clock. Diversionary tunnels were dug to draw German attention away from the main galleries. Work schedules were adjusted to minimize noise during periods when German listeners were most active. But the greatest protection was depth. The Messines tunnels were dug far deeper than anything the Germans expected, in some cases over 100 feet below the surface. At that depth, sound traveled differently. The scrape of picks was muffled, diffused, harder to locate. The Germans knew something was happening, but they could not find it. Month after month, the tunnels crept forward. The men who dug them lived in a state of constant tension, knowing that each shift might be their last. They developed rituals, superstitions, ways of coping with fear that could not be acknowledged openly. Some carried lucky charms, coins, photographs, letters from home. Others developed habits of silence, speaking only when necessary, as if words themselves might attract the attention of the enemy. Oliver Woodward watched his men with a mixture of admiration and concern. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They did not charge across open ground or fire rifles at visible enemies. Their courage was quieter, more sustained, more corrosive. Day after day they descended into the darkness, knowing that at any moment that the earth might become their grave. In his diary, Woodward reflected on the nature of this courage. "The bravest thing a man can do," he wrote, "is not to perform a single act of heroism in the heat of battle. It is to face fear every day, for months on end, and continue to do his duty. These men are the bravest I have ever known, and no one will ever give them medals for it." By the autumn of 1916, the main galleries were approaching their objectives. The next phase would be the most dangerous of all, the excavation of the mine chambers themselves. Each chamber had to be large enough to hold tens of thousands of pounds of explosive. The ammunition would be packed in rubberized bags to protect it from moisture, then stacked carefully in chambers carved from the living earth. The work required precision. Too much disturbance and the chamber might collapse. Too little space and the explosive would not detonate properly. The men who carved these chambers worked in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The air was thick and hot, barely breathable. The walls pressed in from all sides. Candles flickered and died in the oxygen-depleted atmosphere, leaving the workers in darkness so complete that they could not see their own hands. And through it all, they knew exactly what they were building. This was not a weapon that would wound or capture. The mines of Messines Ridge were designed to kill thousands of men in a single instant, without warning, without mercy. The tunnelers understood this. They had calculated the blast radius, estimated the casualties, imagined what would happen when nearly 1 million pounds of explosive detonated beneath men who had no idea it was coming. Some struggled with this knowledge. Private letters from the tunneling companies reveal a profound moral questioning that rarely appears in official histories. These men were not philosophers or theologians. They were miners, working men, volunteers who had enlisted to defend their country. But they were also human beings, capable of imagination, capable of empathy, capable of understanding that the men above them, the Germans in their trenches, with their own families, their own fears, their own hopes, were not so different from themselves. Joe Woodward himself wrestled with these questions. In a diary entry from late 1916, he wrote words that capture the moral weight carried by every tunneler at Messines. "We are building a cathedral of death," he wrote. "Each day we dig closer to the moment when thousands of men will die in a single instant. I try not to think about who they are. I try to remember that they would do the same to us. But late at night, in the silence of the tunnels, I wonder what kind of men we are becoming." There was no easy answer. There never is in war. The tunnelers continued their work because they believed it would save lives. Not German lives, but British and Australian and New Zealand lives, the lives of the men who would have to assault Messines Ridge if the mines failed. They told themselves that a swift, decisive blow was more merciful than the prolonged slaughter of conventional warfare. They told themselves that they were doing their duty. But the knowledge stayed with them. The weight of what they were creating pressed down like the earth itself, heavy and inescapable. By early 1917, the mines were nearly complete. 19 of the original 21 charges had been successfully placed. 2 tunnels had been abandoned due to flooding and German countermining, but the remaining 19 represented an explosive force unprecedented in human history. Nearly 1 million pounds of ammunition now lay beneath Messines Ridge, connected by miles of wire to detonators that waited in British dugouts. The largest single explosion ever planned was ready. All that remained was the waiting. And for the tunnelers, men who had spent months in darkness, building instruments of mass death, the waiting was perhaps the hardest part of all. The spring of 1917 was a season of unbearable tension for the men who had built the mines beneath Messines Ridge. Above ground, the war continued its grinding rhythm. Artillery duels, trench raids, the constant attrition of snipers and disease and the random violence of shellfire. Soldiers lived and died in the mud of Flanders without any knowledge of what lay beneath their feet. The vast network of tunnels, the massive charges, the weapon that would reshape the landscape itself. But for the tunnelers, every day brought a new fear, discovery. German counter-mining operations had intensified dramatically in the early months of 1917. Enemy listeners reported suspicious activity along the entire Messines front. Probing tunnels were pushed forward, searching for the deep galleries that intelligence suggested must exist. Several times, German miners came within feet of the main British tunnels. Camouflages were exchanged. Men died in the darkness, their bodies left in collapsed galleries that could not be recovered. The British command faced an agonizing dilemma. The mines were ready, the charges were in place, but the infantry assault that would follow the detonation required careful preparation. The movement of troops, the stockpiling of ammunition, the coordination of artillery. General Plumer needed time, and every day of delay increased the risk that the Germans would find the mines. Captain Oliver Woodward, responsible for two of the largest charges beneath Hill 60, lived with this tension constantly. His tunnels were among the deepest and most technically demanding on the entire front. They were also among the most vulnerable. German activity in the sector had been increasing for weeks. His listeners reported sounds that suggested the enemy was probing closer, always closer. In his diary, Woodward recorded the psychological toll of these final weeks. "We have done everything possible," he wrote in late May. "The charges are placed, the wires are connected, everything is ready, and yet I cannot sleep. Every night I lie awake, listening for the sound that will tell me the Germans have found us. Every morning, I descend into the tunnels, expecting to find them flooded, collapsed, or worse. The waiting is harder than the digging ever was." The men who maintained the tunnels during this period performed work that history has largely forgotten. The mines could not simply be left unattended. Groundwater seeped constantly into the galleries, threatening to damage the explosive charges. The ammonal had to be kept dry, the detonation wires checked and rechecked, the tunnel walls inspected for signs of collapse. Teams of tunnelers descended daily into workings that might, at any moment, be destroyed by German countermining. They called it nursemaiding the mines, a grimly humorous term for work that required extraordinary courage. These men were not digging toward an objective. They were not building something new. They were simply keeping death alive, tending to weapons that waited in the darkness for the moment of their release. Private Edward Lynch, a miner from Broken Hill who served with the First Australian Tunnelling Company, described the experience in a letter to his brother. "It's queer work," he wrote. "We go down into the tunnels knowing they're packed with enough explosive to blow us all to kingdom come. We check the wires, pump out the water, shore up the walls, and all the time we're listening for the Germans. If they find us now, after all this work, it will have been for nothing. Sometimes I think the waiting will drive us mad before the Germans ever get the chance." Lynch survived the war. He returned to Broken Hill, married his childhood sweetheart, and worked in the mines until his retirement. According to his family, he never spoke of Messines. When asked about his war service, he would say only that he had been underground for a while and changed the subject. As May turned to June, the preparations above ground accelerated. Thousands of troops were moved into position. Artillery batteries were registered on their targets. Medical stations were established to handle the expected casualties. The largest military operation in the history of the British Empire was taking shape, and at its heart lay the 19 mines that the tunnelers had spent nearly 2 years preparing. The date was set, June 7th, 1917. 0 hour would be 3:10 in the morning, when the darkness would provide cover for the advancing infantry, and the German garrison would be at its lowest state of alertness. In the final days before the attack, the tunnelers made their last inspections. They descended into galleries they had carved with their own hands, walked past chambers packed with enough explosive to level a city block, checked connections they had checked 100 times before. Some wrote letters home, not knowing if they would survive to see the results of their work. Others sat in silence, contemplating what was about to happen. Oliver Woodward made his final inspection of the Hill 60 mines on June 5th. Everything was ready. The charges were dry, the wires were intact, the detonators were functioning. 2 years of work, hundreds of lives, countless acts of courage and endurance. All of it came down to this. That night, Woodward wrote what he thought might be his final diary entry. "Tomorrow we will know if it was worth it," he wrote. "Tomorrow, thousands of men will die in an instant because of what we built. I try to tell myself that it will save more lives than it takes. I try to believe that this is war, and war demands such choices, but I cannot escape the feeling that we have created something monstrous. May God forgive us for what we are about to do." The night of June 6th was clear and still. A half moon hung over the Flanders plain, casting pale light on the trenches that scarred the landscape. In their dugouts, British and Anzac soldiers checked their equipment, wrote finals, letters, tried to sleep. Most knew that a major attack was coming. Few understood what would precede it. In the tunnels beneath Messines Ridge, the final preparations were complete. The detonation wires ran from the 19 mine chambers to a series of exploder boxes positioned in protected dugouts behind the British lines. Each box was manned by a tunneling officer who had been given the responsibility of triggering the charges at the appointed moment. One push of the plunger, and the work of 2 years would be unleashed. At 2 a.m., General Plumer arrived at his headquarters to oversee the final hour. He had staked his reputation on this operation. If the mines failed to detonate, or if the Germans had discovered and neutralized them, the infantry assault would become another bloodbath, another entry in the endless ledger of failed offensives. But Plumer believed in his tunnelers. He believed in the plan. At 3 a.m., the British artillery fell silent. For 10 minutes, an eerie quiet descended over the battlefield. German sentries, accustomed to the constant rumble of guns, stirred uneasily. Something was wrong. The silence itself felt like a warning. At 3:10 a.m., the plungers were pushed. What happened next defies adequate description. 19 mines detonated within seconds of each other, releasing nearly 1 million pounds of explosive energy in a single cataclysmic moment. The earth heaved. Columns of flame and debris shot hundreds of feet into the air. The sound was heard in London, 140 miles away. In Dublin, people emerged from their homes, wondering if Ireland itself was under attack. At the epicenter, the effect was apocalyptic. Entire sections of Messines Ridge simply ceased to exist. Where German trenches had stood moments before, there were now craters large enough to swallow cathedrals. Men who had been sleeping in their dugouts were vaporized, leaving no trace that they had ever existed. Others were buried under tons of earth, killed instantly by the concussive force. Still others were thrown into the air like dolls, their bodies found hundreds of yards from where they had been standing. The German garrison at Messines, approximately 10,000 men, was effectively destroyed in a single instant. Oliver Woodward watched the detonation from an observation post on a nearby ridge. He had positioned himself where he could see the results of his work, where he could witness the culmination of 2 years of effort and sacrifice. What he saw shook him to his core. "The earth rose and fell like the sea," he wrote later. "Great columns of fire and smoke shot up, and the whole ridge seemed to lift and then collapse. I felt no triumph, only a kind of terrible awe at what we had created, and grief, for them and perhaps for us." In the immediate aftermath of the detonation, the British and Anzac infantry advanced. They found a landscape transformed. Where the German defences had been strongest, there were now only craters. Vast smoking pits filled with debris and the unrecognizable remains of men. Resistance was sporadic, disorganized. German soldiers who had survived the blast stumbled through the ruins in a state of shock, many surrendering without a fight. Their world had ended. They could not comprehend what had happened. The Battle of Messines that followed was one of the most successful operations of the entire war. British casualties were relatively light. The objectives that had seemed impregnable were taken within hours. For once, the attackers suffered fewer losses than the defenders. But success on the battlefield could not erase what had happened in that single terrible moment. 10,000 men had died in an instant, not in battle, not fighting for their lives, but simply erased from existence by a weapon they never saw coming. Many of their bodies were never recovered. They remained beneath the fields of Belgium, entombed in the craters that marked their deaths, silent witnesses to the industrialized horror of modern warfare. The tunnelers had done their job. The weapon they built had worked exactly as intended. and they would carry the weight of that knowledge for the rest of their lives. In the days following the Battle of Messines, the world struggled to comprehend what had happened. Newspapers across the Allied nations celebrated the victory. Headlines proclaimed the destruction of the German defences, the relatively light casualties, the proof that the stalemate could be broken. Generals who had presided over years of failed offensives pointed to Messines as vindication of their strategies. Politicians spoke of turning points, of the beginning of the end for Germany. But in the tunnelling companies, there was no celebration. The men who had built the mines understood what the newspapers did not, or could not, acknowledge. 10,000 human beings had been killed in a single instant. Not soldiers fighting for their lives, not men given the chance to surrender or retreat, simply erased, vaporized, buried under tons of earth that had been their own fortifications moments before. Captain Oliver Woodward, whose mines beneath Hill 60 had performed exactly as designed, found himself unable to share in the triumphant mood. In the days after the detonation, he walked the battlefield, surveying the craters his work had created. What he saw stayed with him for the rest of his life. "I stood at the edge of one of the craters," he wrote in his diary. "It was enormous, perhaps 300 feet across and 70 feet deep. The walls were still smoking, and somewhere beneath all that earth were the men we had killed. I tried to imagine what their last moments had been like. Had they heard anything? Had they known even for an instant what was happening? Or had death come so quickly that they simply ceased to exist, without pain, without awareness, without even the chance to be afraid?" Woodward found no comfort in these questions. The certainty that his enemies had died quickly, painlessly, did nothing to ease the weight of what he had helped create. He had become, in his own words, an engineer of death on a scale I could never have imagined. The tunnellers who survived Messines returned to their units, but they were not the same men who had descended into the darkness months or years before. Some threw themselves into new assignments, seeking in work a refuge from memory. Others grew quiet, withdrawn, unable to speak of what they had experienced. A few broke down entirely, their minds finally surrendering to the accumulated horror of years spent underground, listening for death, building weapons of mass destruction. The army had no vocabulary for what these men suffered. Shell shock was the closest term available, but it did not capture the particular nature of tunnelling trauma. The slow, grinding terror of working in confined spaces, the constant anticipation of burial alive, the moral weight of creating instruments of mass death. These were not wounds that could be bandaged or disabilities that could be measured. They were invisible injuries, carried in silence, rarely acknowledged and never fully healed. Private. William Johnson, a coal miner from Newcastle who had served with the 3rd Australian Tunnelling Company, was evacuated from the front in August 1917 with what the medical officer described as nervous exhaustion. He had not been wounded in any conventional sense. He had simply stopped functioning, unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to tolerate the sound of digging or the sensation of being underground. Johnson was sent to a convalescent hospital in England, where he spent 3 months staring at walls and refusing to speak. When he finally recovered enough to be interviewed, he told the doctor only that he had heard too much in the dark. He was discharged from the army as medically unfit and returned to Australia, where he lived the rest of his life above ground, working as a farmhand in the open fields of Queensland. He never entered a mine again. His story was not unusual. Across the tunnelling companies, men who had spent their careers underground, men who had faced cave-ins and explosions and every hazard the earth could offer, emerged from the war unable to tolerate enclosed spaces. The darkness that had been their workplace became their prison, haunting their dreams, triggering panic in situations that would have seemed routine before the war. Oliver Woodward survived the war. He returned to Australia in 1919, resumed his career as a mining engineer, married and raised a family. By all outward measures, he lived a successful and fulfilling life, but he carried Messines with him always. In the decades after the war, Woodward rarely spoke of his tunnelling service. When asked about his time on the Western Front, he would deflect with generalities, changing the subject to safer topics. His children knew that their father had done something important during the war, something involving mines and tunnels, but the details remain shrouded in silence. It was only in his final years that Woodward began to write about his experiences. Working in private, he produced a memoir that was never published during his lifetime. The manuscript, discovered by his family after his death in 1966, reveals a man still wrestling with the moral implications of what he had done nearly 50 years before. "We did what our country asked of us," Woodward wrote in one of the final passages. "We built the weapons that command required. We killed the enemy by the thousands, and we saved lives, our own lives, the lives of the men who would have had to assault those ridges if the mines had not done their work. I believe this. I have to believe this." But belief, Woodward acknowledged, was not the same as peace. "I do not ask for forgiveness," he continued. "I do not even ask for understanding. I only ask that those who come after us remember that we were men, not machines. We felt fear. We felt doubt. We questioned what we were doing even as we did it. And in the end, we did what soldiers have always done. We followed orders, we served our country, and we lived with the consequences." Woodward died in 1966 at the age of 80. He was buried with military honors, his service to the nation officially recognized, but his private struggles known only to those closest to him. His memoir was eventually published in 2007, bringing his story to a new generation of readers who had never heard of the Tunneling War. Today, more than a century after the Battle of Messines, the landscape of Flanders has healed. The craters left by the 19 mines have filled with water, becoming small lakes that reflect the Belgian sky. Farmers work fields that were once the most contested ground on earth. Sheep graze on grass that grows over the bones of thousands of men. The trenches are gone, the barbed wire rusted away, the shell holes smoothed by decades of rain and cultivation. But beneath the surface, the tunnels remain. Most have collapsed, their timbers rotted, their galleries crushed by the slow pressure of the earth. But some sections survive, frozen in time, sealed off from the world above, containing the equipment, the remnants, and sometimes the remains of the men who fought there. Archaeological surveys have mapped portions of this underground battlefield, revealing a hidden world that most visitors to the Western Front never see. And there is something else beneath those peaceful fields, something that has waited in the darkness for over a century. Of the 19 mines detonated on June 7, 1917, all performed as designed, but 2 additional mines, part of the original plan but abandoned due to flooding and German countermining, were never recovered. Their charges remained in place, sealed in tunnels that could not be safely entered. One of these mines detonated accidentally in 1955, struck by lightning during a summer storm. The explosion killed a single cow but caused no human casualties. The crater it left can still be seen today, a reminder of the violence that sleeps beneath the surface. The other mine has never been found. Somewhere beneath a Belgian farm, in a tunnel dug over a century ago by men who are now dust, an estimated 22,000 pounds of ammonal explosive lies waiting. The charge has degraded over the decades, its reliability uncertain. Experts disagree about whether it could still detonate, or whether time has rendered it harmless, but no one knows for certain, and no one has been willing to dig down and find out. The farmers who work the land above this silent weapon know it is there. They have lived with this knowledge for generations, accepting it as part of the landscape, part of the history that shaped their corner of the world. When asked about it, they shrug. The mine has been there for 100 years. It will probably be there for 100 more. Life continues. The Anzac tunnelers left no great monuments. Their war was fought in darkness, in silence, in conditions that defied imagination. They did not charge across open ground or plant flags on captured positions. They did not perform the kind of heroics that inspire statues and ceremonies. But they were heroes nonetheless. They volunteered for the most dangerous work of the entire conflict. They faced fear not in moments of crisis, but in the slow, grinding terror of months spent underground. They built weapons of unprecedented destruction, knowing exactly what those weapons would do, and they carried the weight of that knowledge, in silence, for the rest of their lives. Their courage was not the courage of the moment. It was the courage of endurance. The decision, made again and again, to descend into the darkness and do what had to be done, It was the courage to listen for death in the silence of the tunnels. It was the courage to build instruments of mass destruction and live with the moral consequences. History has largely forgotten them. The tunneling war receives a fraction of the attention devoted to the trenches above. The names of the men who dug and died beneath the Western Front are known only to specialists and descendants. Their sacrifices are commemorated in no great memorials, but in their letters, their diaries, their carefully maintained war records, we find a testament to a form of courage that deserves to be remembered. These men went into the earth so that others might live on its surface. They created terrible weapons, and they were haunted by what they had done. They showed mercy when they could, and they accepted mercy when it was offered. They were human beings, flawed, frightened, brave, questioning, who fought a war that has been largely erased from memory. This documentary has been an attempt to bring them back into the light. To the miners of Broken Hill and Kalgoorlie, of Newcastle and the Hunter Valley, of the coalfields of New Zealand, the men who descended into the darkness of the Western Front and did their duty in conditions that would break most people, we owe a debt that can never be fully repaid. We can only remember, and we can ensure that their story is told